Let's welcome Jim and the panel.
Thank you all again. It's good to be back up on the platform. I think we got a couple people still out there at the break, but we're going to get started to respect all your time. It is an honor for me to be on this platform with so much experience. I feel like the infant in regards to the experience that's here. These folks have really poured their careers into advancing the issues of life here across our state. And so you're just going to learn a lot about them. So we're talking about influencers. What is an influencer? We're going to get into that. And so first, I just wanted to ask everyone just to introduce themselves and their role. So Skip, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jim. Most people come to appreciation for a pro-life perspective first by reading their Bible and then studying science and philosophy. I was a little bit different. I came out of the military in 70, and the next election was McGovern, where his unofficial anthem was acid, amnesty, and abortion. And I didn't like acid or amnesty, so I figured I didn't like abortion. So I was studying at Michigan State criminal justice, biology, and formal logic at the same time. Criminal justice, I was studying the American Law Institute's proposal for abortion reform, which was just a zillion exceptions to a prohibition. I was studying biology and formal logic, and it occurred to me that the whole concept of abortion rights was completely unscientific, unbiological, and I just couldn't accept it for that reason. After that, I started reading my Bible. So then I went to law school, and when I got out, I read about Jim Hunt started with our tax money, unappropriated money that was actually reversions from rest homes, and he started his state abortion fund. I said, that can't be right. So I filed a suit against him, Stam versus State, and back in 1978. And I'd never really heard of Right to Life or any of the organizations, but about the day after I filed it, they came to me and said, oh, why don't you be our Wake County chairman? So that's how I got into it.
Tammy.
I'm Tammy Fitzgerald with the North Carolina Values Coalition.
And tell us a little bit about your organization.
Okay. Well, NC Values Coalition is a statewide grassroots organization, and we exist to honor Christ so that we can build coalitions that will advance the issues of life, marriage and family, and religious freedom.
Go ahead, John.
Very good. John Rustin. I'm the president of the North Carolina Family Policy Council, and appreciate the opportunity to be here, Jim. I will have to say that I'm really honored to be on the stage here with, Jim, Skip, and Tammy. Tammy and I started, I don't know if I'm sure you remember this, but...
Of course.
Yeah, back in 1994, started a community impact team committee at our church together, not too far from here,
right,
at Crossroads Fellowship. And that's when the Lord put really a burden on my heart to get involved. I became a Christian in high school, went through college and really didn't know what I was being called to do or being led to do. Graduated from college, started working, got married, and then soon after that, felt the Lord just put a real calling on my heart to get involved. And so Tammy and I were in church together, and we both had, I think, a similar passion to want to serve the Lord in the arena of public policy and politics, and started up that community impact team at Crossroads Fellowship, and really worked to, as we're still doing now, to educate, equip, and motivate fellow Christians to get involved, to get educated, to get involved, and then to take action in a way that brings glory and honor to the Lord, and is consistent with biblical principles. And that's what we really try to do at the Family Policy Council, is to bring God's truth to bear in the arenas of public policy and politics.
So, John, you've been working on pro-life issues for, it sounds like almost 30 years now.
I was 2 when I started. So.
And so looking back at all that you've done, is there a moment, is there something, an experience, a bill, something you said, wow, this, even though this is really tough work, this has made it all worthwhile? Can you look back and share a personal story?
That's a great question, Jim. Honestly, I can't think of a specific bill. There have been lots of bills. I mean, we've worked on tons of bills over the years. Some that we've seen great success with, and some that we haven't. Bills that we've worked to get passed and have been successful. Bills that we've worked to defeat that were bad, that got defeated. I think the real thing for me is just seeing God's hand at work in what we do. Even down, as crazy as it sounds, down in the state legislature, God is intimately concerned about the affairs of man and what we do. And so the victories and the defeats for me are not so much, I mean, I don't have a chalkboard at home and I come home and say, we got another win or another loss today. But it's seeing God's hand at work in that and being affirmed that, he still cares about what we do. And it's not as much about the outcome of any piece of legislation, but it's more about the condition of people's hearts. And so as we have the opportunity to engage with elected officials and other decision makers about issues, the getting good bills passed and bad bills defeated is important, but what's even more important is those relationships and just, again, seeing God's hand at work and knowing that he has not, despite all of our attempts to shun him and push him away as a culture, he has not removed his hand of grace and mercy from us. And so as long as I continue to see that, that's where my passion is going to be.
That is so good. Tammy, what about you? Is there an experience or something when you look back that's really memorable?
Well, I was thinking about what John said as he was speaking, and I was remembering the passage of the marriage amendment almost 10 years ago. It will be 10 years next month in just a few days. And just leading that campaign and working with all the different groups around the state and all the people around the state. I still have people come up to me and say, I was the marriage coordinator for so-and-so county. And they're proud of that. And so that experience was really something where we saw God at work. I wish I had written a book about all the miracles that we experienced during that experience, all the times we saw God's hand produce something. I still remember the day we were all in a meeting, a staff meeting, and we got word that Franklin Graham and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association were putting full-page ads in 14 newspapers around the state. That was wonderful because we had been praying for them to be involved in the campaign, and God just did it. And so that was a really wonderful experience. Another one was during the House Bill 2 experience, which many of you may recall, just getting it passed and working with all the groups around the state then to try to keep it in place. Of course, that was unsuccessful. But I think we're proving, it's proving right now that HB 2 was a really good thing. A lot of people I've seen on the news lately have been referring back to North Carolina's bathroom bill and wishing that North Carolina had stood strong on the bill. One of the experiences during the bathroom bill was when we had a couple of press conferences out in front of the Capitol. We had about 70 black pastors come and support House Bill 2. And then another one inside the state legislative building, we had around 100 Hispanic pastors come to support House Bill 2, and they met with legislators. And when you just see the breadth of the support for the issues that we work on among different races, different ethnic groups, different political parties even, it is amazing to see that these issues, the life issue, the marriage and family issues, religious freedom, they appeal across party lines, and we really are on the right side of history when we work on these issues.
Yeah, that's so good. So Skip, you've served as a legislator, both in the minority and also in the majority, and certainly have had your hand, in several bills, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But, what's been meaningful to you? Was it an experience of a constituent coming in, or what's memorable to you as you've served as a legislator?
Two things. One was 11 years ago when we overrode a veto to pass the Woman's Right to Know Act, and at that time a 24-hour waiting period. We just passed it by just enough votes to get it through, and I remember a lot of high fives and a lot of happy people. One thing that didn't receive so much attention happened a couple of decades before that. I received a call from a lady in Goldsboro. She said, "You know what? They took my daughter to school today, and when she came home, she told me that the school had taken her to the abortion clinic and transferred her back to school. And Mom, I didn't even tell you." And from my perspective, that was the beginnings of the Parental Consent Act, which took a couple of decades after that to pass.
That is shocking. So for me, working with influencers, the first time I came to the legislature and we went into the chapel, and volunteers were standing there with lawmakers, with many of you in prayer, was certainly memorable, because here we are. It's one thing to do it on a Sunday morning, but it's another thing to actually stand in the chapel and pray with these lawmakers. You're certainly there to advocate for a pro-life bill, have discussions with them in their office. But for that 30 minutes, there was a focus on Scripture, there's a focus on prayer, and it certainly was very memorable for me. So we're talking about bills. Earlier today, we heard Chelsea talk about the Texas bill. And so talk a little bit about how a bill is created. Help our folks understand, because these things just don't drop out of the air. Tammy, maybe you want to get started. How does a bill created in North Carolina, specifically pro-life, and what have you all done in the past?
Well, the three of us have been involved for years in a committee that meets outside the legislative session, and we talk about and discuss what bills we think would be good to pass during that particular year on the pro-life issue. And so there's a lot of discussion, research, collaboration with national pro-life organizations that go on, and then quite typically we'll meet with legislators before the legislative session just to get their feedback and to see how they're feeling about certain bills. We usually have a variety of bills from which to choose, and it's hard to always determine which is the best set of bills to go forward with. But the legislators usually ferret that out themselves and determine. And so we try to help them by providing language for the legislation, by talking through the legal issues ahead of time, where we might have problems, by making sure that there are not any issues with the bill that would be objectionable during debate or discussion or even in the courts afterwards. And then the legislators decide who will be the sponsors for the bill, and they file the bill. And normally in the House, there are 4 primary sponsors. In the Senate, there are 3. And then after the bill is filed, there's a certain period of time within which all the other legislators can put their name on the bill as a co-sponsor for the bill. And so that we usually try to get, and we usually make phone calls and go by legislators' offices to try and get a large number of sponsors, co-sponsors on the bill, because that will indicate that you have a lot of support for the bill right at the time it's filed. And it's a strategic move to make sure to send a message to leadership and to the Democrats that this bill has a lot of support. And, yeah.
So Skip, I've been in one of those sessions when you were actually a legislator and we're having one of those meetings. So tell us from a legislator's perspective, how this then proceeds, and how from all of us sitting in the room, sometimes it's frustrating. What we see, another state advocating for something, and why isn't it happening here? And so tell us from a legislator's perspective, how all this happens.
Jim, if you want to go somewhere by train, you find a train that a lot of people are going. So you try to gather your support. Values Coalition, Family Policy Council, North Carolina Right to Life, Bill Pincus and Will Moore are here. And you try to get all together so you're pushing for the same thing. And usually we are. Then, if you get that done with a lot of sponsors, you have reached first base. Now, a lot of people think that's a home run to file a bill. They put it in their newsletters, I filed a bill. That's first base. Then you have to navigate your way through a labyrinth of obstacles. Financial, like what kind of fiscal note it gets. I can give you a lot of examples. Incarceration notes, committee chairs that don't like your bill, and you just have to get around all the obstacles. And if you can prepare your bill ahead of time to meet as many of those obstacles as possible, it goes smoother. Like, you might want to change the title so it would appeal to one chair instead of another chair. Or you follow what I'm saying. And you get it through the House and maybe the Senate, and you're at second base. And I'll tell you later how you make a home run.
So John, when this is all happening as an influencer, we all understand today social influencers and what they do out on social media, YouTube channels and how they make money. But, you're representing an influencing organization. So what are you doing as an influencer when Skip, as a legislator, is advancing this bill and working with chairs? What is the role of influencers? What your organization, what NC Values is doing? What are you doing? Because I know you're not just sitting back.
No, we're not sitting back at all. We have, by that time, hopefully, have done a lot of analysis of the bill, understand it well, understand the arguments that will be made in favor and against the legislation. We will draft issue briefs that are specifically tailored to educate legislators who are going to be voting on these bills, so they will understand the benefits or detriments of a piece of legislation. And then we'll be meeting with legislators on a daily basis, carving out time to sit with them and talk with them about it. A lot of times that's not necessarily setting a meeting to go sit down with them, a scheduled meeting, although that's becoming more commonplace now. But a lot of the times it's catching them in the hallway as they're walking from a committee meeting to another committee meeting and having a brief conversation. So you really have to have that sort of so-called elevator speech about your position on a bill, so you can communicate it and convey that very quickly. And you're looking at the bills, as Skip talked about, the process of committees that the bill is going to go through, studying what you know about all the members of those committees, how they're likely to vote on the bill, who you need to go really focus on. And then that brings in the whole aspect of the grassroots effort, which is educating the public and our constituencies about, hey, this bill has been introduced, here's what it does, here's the process that it's going to go through, and here's what you can do and what you need to do to have your voice heard in that process. Because we can be down there and, based on the years that we've spent building relationships with legislators and kind of do our work there, but if folks back home in those legislators' districts aren't contacting them with the same information, then we're not nearly as effective as we can be, and we're really not doing our full job. So it's a lot of work within the legislative building, but then a lot of work outside the legislative building to educate and encourage and activate the public to contact their legislators. And one thing on that note that I'll say is people often hugely underestimate the impact that they can have when they contact their legislator. And so we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, but that is an absolutely essential part of successful advocacy is having the public to be fully engaged, again, educated, aware, and then engaging at the right time to really get that message to their elected officials when it's most important, when a bill's coming up in the committee, when it's coming to the House or Senate floor, that sort of thing.
And so, Tammy, this morning we talked about the culture, the politics following the culture. And so tell us at NC Values, how are you engaging grassroots? How are you, John's explained, it's so critical for legislators to hear from people. How can churches, how can our folks here, how some pregnancy centers, how can they make a difference in this grassroots effort?
Well, the first way is we try to inform people about what's going on at the legislature, in legislation. And then we invite people into the process, either through writing letters and emails to their elected officials or through making phone calls. We go out across the state and speak a lot. We speak about the bills that we are working on at the legislature, and that's an opportunity to get people informed and then equip them to the point that they want to be actively engaged in the process. But John is right. The most incentive a legislator has is doing something that a constituent has asked him or her to do. And so it's not doing what John or I ask them to do, it's doing what the people who vote for them ask them to do. We also engage in the election process, and through that we put out a legislative scorecard. So we are basically trying to inform people how their legislators vote on pro-family issues. And we've just put our scorecard out a couple of months ago on our website, and we grade people on a scale of 1 to 100. And so that's a way to actually influence legislation, because when legislators don't get as good a vote as they think they should get, I always get a call. And they ask me, this is the most frequent, why did I get an A instead of an A+? And there are lots of overachievers in the legislature, but we put the scorecard out so that we can help people know how their legislators are voting on these issues, and the legislators can feel the pressure of people back home knowing that they know how they're voting. And so the legislative process is greatly influenced by the electoral process. And if you're involved in elections and they know it, they're going to be much more responsive to you when you ask them to vote for a bill. If they know you're a voter, if they've seen you working the polls, they're going to know that they need to listen to you because you're an active voter.
That's so true. So Skip, when you were a legislator, what moved you? What was it? Was it the 1,000 emails that you got in your inbox from the supporters of Planned Parenthood? What was it that really, moved you as a legislator, not only in pro-life bills, but just in general?
Yeah. Jim spoke about this earlier, the effect of an email versus personal visit, and I'd like to give you a mathematical way of thinking about this. You might want to write it down. I put a paper on your desk that you can write it on that paper. It's on, and it's got my email on there. By the way, you can improve my influence by sending me an email and let me put you on my list. I send out emails to 4,000 people whenever I feel like it. And it's usually about something you'd be interested in. But here's the mathematics. When you receive an email at the legislature, you can tell by about the third one if it's a mass email that was written by somebody else, but you're getting it. And after about 3, we don't read them. We count them. And they're useful because if they're on my side, I'll save them and then send you all out the results of that push that you did. Okay. So that's useful, but it's not very useful. It certainly doesn't change anybody's mind unless there's tens of thousands of them. But if you write a personal email, you will probably get you wrote it yourself, or your husband or wife wrote it, or your kid. but it comes in and it's not a duplicate of something else. That's 10 times more valuable, 10 times more. But you want to have a little more influence? Make a phone call. That's 100 times more valuable than that mass email, because they know that you're taking some time to do it. But guess what? Our time there is very valuable. A lot of times we're eating lunch while walking, eating breakfast while reading, and we don't have a lot of time. And if we get you on the phone, you call us on the phone, I always would get a book nearby, something to eat, in case you kept me on the phone longer than about 30 seconds and you couldn't tell what I was multitasking. Okay, so that personal call is 100 times more valuable. But you want to multiply your efforts? Go see somebody. Because then I can't be hiding behind a book or whatever. You see my eyes and you know I'm paying attention. So that's worth 1,000 times more than a mass email, right?
That's right. And this time of year, if there's somebody that is pro-life that you want to really get behind, in many parts of the state, they're running for re-election. And so they're holding house parties, events at their office, events around their county. Show up. You know, many times you don't have to make a donation. That's between you and your family. But you can show up and you can have a conversation. So you don't have to always travel to Raleigh in order to show up. You can show up in their district.
And this brings me to the multiple of another 10 times, and that is, if you speak to your representative or senator in the off season, particularly at election time, but not necessarily, and you're in that person's district, it's worth 10,000 mass emails. So expand your influence by going to see them now.
Can I add to that?
You sure can.
Yes. I think it's really important to talk to your candidates while they're running for office about what's important to you, because they're going to be predisposed once they are elected to office because they've already heard from you what's important to you. And I just wanted to also say that today, NC Values Coalition released our primary election guide. We partner with iVoter Guide, a group out of Texas, and we have ranked all the candidates in a digital format voter's guide. And so when you are voting, it's important to look up and do some research on the candidates to see which ones are pro-life and how pro-life they are. And that's one way you can tell. John's group puts out a voter guide too. And so you could use their voter's guide or our voter's guide, but do some research and find out where they stand on the pro-life issue as you vote.
So John, as you've been interacting with legislators, what catches their attention? We've been talking about this. What have you experienced that makes them, maybe look at that lobbying sheet that you're giving them?
Well, I've got a little presentation, and like any good Baptist sermon, it has 3 points and alliteration. So it's called the 3 Ps of effective advocacy. The first P is the policies. You've got to learn the issues. The second P is the process, and as we've talked about, how a bill becomes a law, that sort of thing. The third P is the people, and it's relationships with the people and understanding what motivates elected officials in this case to make decisions to support a piece of legislation or to oppose it. And there's so many different factors that can go into what influences decision-making of elected officials. It could be a personal history or background with an issue. It could be their spouse's occupation and their alliance to, that employer, whether it's a public school or a corporation or something like that. It could be, in some cases, the seatmate that they have in the House chamber on the floor that influences them on a bill that they really don't know a whole lot about. I've had legislators tell me, I heard from one constituent back home on this issue, and that's the way I voted, because that's what I heard. And it wasn't an issue that I was terribly well informed about or passionate about. And so on a lot of the issues that we work on, which are, of course, the non-controversial issues like sanctity of life and religious liberty and parental rights and school choice, those types of things, people pretty much know oftentimes their position on those issues. But there's so many different angles of influence, and part of our jobs, and part of your jobs too, is really as you get to know elected officials and build relationships with them, is to understand kind of where they're coming from on issues, and then knowing that, take to them the information or the perspective that's going to help them understand why this piece of legislation is important or why they should not support this sort of thing. So I think it really varies from person to person what really influences them to make decisions. But again, investing in the time and energy to engage in communication with them and in relation with them so that you can know what those areas of influence are is really important.
If I could add to that, when I was in the legislature in a leadership role, I would have a notebook with every member of the House, and my aides would put any, scoop off the internet, anything about them would come in. So I knew a little something about them. Now, I wouldn't expect any of y'all to do that, but if you're live in a district, you have a representative, you have a senator, if you want to be effective, you might want to just keep a notebook on those two people.
I have a different perspective, and I agree with everything that's been said so far, but I believe that it's hard to get people who don't share your worldview to advance your worldview. And so I go back to the election process where elections are so important. It is important to support candidates who share your worldview and to be actively engaged in elections. Because once they get into office, once they're sitting in the legislature, it doesn't matter how much you say to them if they don't share your worldview. And on these issues, on life, on religious liberty, on marriage and family, on school choice, parental rights, these are the tougher issues at the legislature. And so they're not as nuanced as some of the other bills they vote on. And so they will approach a bill from their own worldview. And if you have the wrong people sitting in the office, sitting behind their desk, pushing the red or the green button, it is hard to persuade them if they don't share your worldview.
And Jim, I would also say don't ever assume that you know unless you have full reason to believe and be confident in what your perception of their position on a bill is going to be. Because quite often, unless you have that conversation, again, they may have had some experience in their past that makes them particularly sensitive to an issue. And if you don't go and sit down and talk with them, you have no idea. And so don't assume. Our job as lobbyists is to count votes and get 50% plus one at least in order to get bills through committees and the Senate and House floor and that sort of thing. But we can't ever take for granted that we know. So we've always got to go and talk to members and as best we can find out where they stand on these issues. Kind of the enemy of that is assuming that you know, because your vote count almost always is going to be off some, because there are various reasons and influences why people take positions that they do. So as a member of the public, as a citizen who is reaching out to your legislator to give your perspective, do that and do that boldly, but also ask questions to get their feedback and understand their position, so that you are really engaging more in conversation than just a one-way sort of diatribe about a piece of legislation.
And it takes me back in the assumption model. All of us here worked on the Born Alive bill, and we were working on the override vote. And I remember, and Tammy, I'm going to put you on the spot if you remember the story, but we had brought Gianna Jessen into state, and she went around and met with all of the legislators. She's an abortion survivor. If you don't know her story, I encourage you to look her up on the internet. She's got a very compelling story. And we thought if we could bring her in and she could sit there and she could talk to a legislator, specifically a legislator that was kind of on the fence. Here is a live example of someone that survived an abortion. And we're just simply saying, listen, if a baby survives an abortion, let's provide them medical care, just like if someone went 9 months and gave birth, and we give them medical care. And so Gianna was going door to door and meeting with some of these legislators, and she met with a pastor. She met with a pastor, and he listened to what she had to say. And Tammy, what happened in that interview?
I think I know which one you're talking about, because I was with her that day, and this legislator just ran his fingers through his hair just incessantly, and he looked at the ceiling, he looked at the ground. He was just in pain because he knew what his party expected him to do, but personally he was wanting to vote for the override. And it was heart-wrenching to see him because he was going through so much turmoil over how he was going to vote. And he ultimately voted with his party. And I felt sorry for him because I think it's a sad thing to feel like you're constricted by a political party, and when you're an elected official, you cannot vote your conscience. But that's what happened.
And I believe he was a pastor, was he not?
That particular one was not, but we did talk to a pastor. And the reaction from the pastor was to argue with us. And we were arguing scripture, and he was arguing, circumstances. And so a lot of times people don't act like you expect them to act as John said. You don't know till you go talk to them. But you have to make those asks, and you have to, as a constituent, if you're a voter, you need to be asking your legislator to do the right thing, because they may want to do the right thing, and maybe your voice as a voter in their district is enough to push them over the top and away from their political party and the expectation that comes with that.
And if I could briefly supplement that, if you have somebody on the fence, to have a friend of theirs present in the committee room at the time of the vote is very powerful, especially if the legislator knows they're there. Hey, I'm here today. They're much more likely to vote with you than if you're not.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I would supplement that with saying, how many pastors do we have in the room? I know there are a few. If a pastor comes to meet with legislators or pastors, especially from their district, Skip's multiplication table of influence, sending an email versus an in-person meeting with that legislator when they're back in their district, having a pastor or pastors meet with them is, exponentially more impactful, because even if they aren't necessarily a person of deep personal faith, they know as an elected official that pastor represents not only himself or herself, but a bunch of other constituents, hundreds or maybe even thousands of constituents in their district. And so that's one of the things that we really try to communicate to pastors is you are an incredibly influential person in your community, for lots and lots of reasons, but in the policy and political arena, you definitely are, and elected officials know that. And so that's why, one of the reasons why it's so important for pastors to be involved and engage, and really to lead, to be shepherds of their flock and lead the way, not be kind of pulled along by their congregations. So that is a incredibly influential role that the church has in engaging and impacting public policy.
A detail on that, you would think that all votes are recorded, and it doesn't matter if you're there or not. Everybody will find out how you voted. Not true. A lot of votes are decided on a voice vote, and if you're sitting across you can see how they vote or raise their hands, and that'll never be recorded. But if they know you're watching, they're more likely to vote right. And
in fact, the state Senate rules do not allow recorded votes in committees, and so having people of great influence in those committee meetings, as Skip said, can be very, very important and very influential.
Go ahead,
I have
Tammy.
a story about how influential pastors are. This was 10 years ago when we were trying to get the marriage amendment bill through the legislature, and we had to get some votes from the other party to do it. And we could never get this one person who was a pastor, this one representative who was a pastor to commit, to say, because as John said, we're in the business of counting votes. And so you never want a wishy-washy answer. You want an affirmation, I'm going to vote for the bill. And we could never get this person to say yes or no. So I knew that a school board member in his district, and I contacted this man, and I asked him if he would put a luncheon together of pastors from the community, which he did. So I drove down there. It was a 2-hour drive. We had lunch, and I just talked about the marriage amendment and the merits of the marriage amendment and why we should pass the marriage amendment. I didn't say anything about their elected representative. And about 2/3 of the way through, one of them raised their hands and said, "What about our representative?" And I was like, "Well, funny you should ask." We just don't know. And so I think there were 11 pastors in the room, and they were all colleagues of this one member of the General Assembly, because they were all pastors in the same town. And you know what? We got that pastor's vote.
And I'm sure, Tammy, you didn't have already printed out their contact information. Funny you should ask. Here you go.
Oh, they
I'm sure
knew
you did.
him.
Yeah.
They knew him.
Go ahead. So we were talking about pastors, and in the previous panel, we had some pastors up here, and obviously we've talking about churches and pastors as a key. And so our culture doesn't want the church to be involved in politics, and specifically involved in the issues of life, marriage, and family, school choice. It just, our culture is saying, hey, listen, go to church on Sunday, practice your religion, whatever you'd like to practice. Then on Monday, go ahead and do whatever you want to do, and don't bring those things into our workplace, and don't bring politics into the church. And so because the church is so influential on these issues, how can we as congregants, impact our church, and what tools do you all have to kind of help us do that?
Well, I'll speak up. I mean, if you as a Christian decide that you are going to remove yourself from the world of politics, you are removing yourself from a part of the world that needs you the most. And we cannot live out the Christian life and do it in a public way without engaging in politics. And that's the problem, is a lot of Christians have left politics because they think it's dirty, or they think the church shouldn't be involved in politics. But where did Jesus go? He went to the sinners, right? So the way you can engage your church in the political process, there are several ways, but one is you could create what John and I did in our church, is a community impact team. You could ask the pastor if you could have a committee in the church where you keep track of what's going on politically and how the church can be involved. And then you're the bellwether for the rest of the church. You're the one that rings the bell and says, we need to contact our legislators on this. Another way is you could pass out John's voter's guide at your church, or you could pass out our voter's guide at your church. But you need to help the church be informed so they can be informed voters and know who to vote for. Another way is you can ask the pastor if you could be his assistant on political issues. Most pastors are too busy to really do it themselves. They need someone in the church who's a person that's willing to stand up and take responsibility for this arena of engagement. And the church should be engaged in the political process because we want Christ to be preached. We want to be able to share the gospel with people. And if we do not protect the religious freedoms that we have and the freedoms as Americans, we will find ourselves in a society like Russia where you cannot share the gospel openly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Looks to be maybe 80, 90, 100 people here. And this is probably the most knowledgeable group in North Carolina as to what the actual law of abortion is. But the people in your churches don't actually know what the law is overwhelmingly. What we have on your table is a couple of papers that give exactly what the law is as of today. It's called North Carolina abortion law. It's also on the internet. There's reference to the internet. And then exactly what bills have been passed in the past. And you can use that to educate people. And you can use it with representatives as well, because guess what? A majority, y'all tell me if I'm wrong, a majority of the members of the House and Senate do not know what abortion law is today in North Carolina. They read the newspapers, and the newspapers never get it right.
And Jim, I would give a little bit of I agree with that, but also would just give a little bit of a different perspective too, is that as members of the church, as believers, it's important that when we engage in cultural policy battles, that we understand the reality of the landscape in which we're dealing. And if we believe that God is sovereign over all, that He's the creator of all that we know, and if He's the one who gives us life and the breath of life, and that He's in control, we can have a lot of confidence. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean that we're not going to face controversy. One thing that I like to point out is that when we talk about Christian cultural engagement, we often reference the verses in Matthew 5, part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "You're the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world." And I think it's really interesting that the two verses immediately preceding that, Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So Jesus moves from that to say, you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. I consider that to be an expectation that as we are speaking God's truth and love to our culture, we know that we're going to face controversy. We want to do so in a loving and compassionate way, but we've got to expect that we're going to face persecution and challenges. Jesus says, "For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." What were the prophets who were before them doing? They were speaking God's truth to the culture of the day, and particularly to the political leaders of the day. So when we get out there and we go seek a one-on-one conversation with a legislator, or you feel called to go down to the General Assembly and testify before a committee, or you stand up or sit down at the dinner table at home and have a conversation with family members who may have a different perspective than you do on a particular issue, be it life or something else, you've got to anticipate and know that, hey, if you're speaking God's truth, you're very likely to face some sort of controversy. Expect that, but pray for God's wisdom and pray for His grace so that you can convey and communicate His truth, again, in a loving and compassionate way. And I think that way we are operating in the reality of being Christ-like in our culture that is very un-Christ-like in many respects.
Well, that's a good reminder. We all here are influencers. That's what this panel is. And one of the things that we've really relied on in the last decade is social media. And so back, Skip, when you came to the legislature in 2014, 2010? 03. Social media didn't exist. And so, conservatives have used social media to influence, but it seems like right now, social media is being handicapped. And is no longer what it used to be in order for us to advance a message. And you used to maybe rely on the media more to be able to advance your message and be able to get it out there. And so, what are you using now as techniques to be able to reach the, North Carolina Faith and Freedom? We calculate somewhere about 1.8 million evangelicals across North Carolina. So how are you reaching folks to be able to influence them, whether it be elections, whether it be bills? What's being successful, and how in the room can people connect with what you're doing to be able to advance the message?
I'll be the shortest one on this. I use what was Obama said, he used his pen and his telephone. I use my telephone and my email and just personal discussions. I got off social media a long time ago because almost nothing I read there was true. Let me say this also on that. In our community, there's a lot of cynicism about who really influences legislators. You know, it's those evil lobbyists and the swamp and all that kind of thing. At the state legislature, that's not really true. On issues like this, they're not going to see paid lobbyists unless you call John and Tammy and Bill lobbyists. They're going to hear from individual people who make a whole lot more difference. The big lobbyists just don't line up on bills like this. You're not facing those guys.
Well, Jim, I think you're to your question. We have our email list to our constituencies, but we do rely on social media, on other means of communicating on the media to occasionally interview us. It used to be that we had great relationships with members of the Capitol Press Corps, the mainstream media in North Carolina, and they would interview us all the time on bills. They felt that they had a journalistic, they operated under what they considered to be journalistic integrity and had a duty to present both sides of the issue. That's not the case anymore. And I saw that, I think we all saw that go out the window completely with the whole House Bill 2 debate, where after, in 2016 when that was going on, the media just stopped reaching out to us, and we would try to go to them, but they wouldn't print. They would take the talking points of the Human Rights Campaign and Equality North Carolina and other folks on the other side of the issue and basically print their talking points completely and state it as fact and never even consult, quote, the other side of the issue. And it has continued that way since. And I think we've seen on the national level and, of course, on the state level how volatile the whole media environment is. And so it's becoming more of a challenge. One of the things that I think is beneficial, especially for younger generations, is, it's a two-edged sword, that they rely so much on social media to get information that there is an opportunity for us to get information out through those mechanisms. But those people who are receiving that information are also, they're getting flooded by stuff, but they're willing to hear different perspectives. And so that gives us an entree. We've just got to, a big challenge that we face is not only finding the delivery methods, but also ways of communicating where where a biblical truth is relevant in the culture of the day. And it's difficult. It's tough, but we can do it. And we're seeing it in the pro-life arena where younger generations are just embracing a pro-life message. So there's hope, there's opportunity there, but we've got to face that continual challenge of effectively communicating God's truth in a loving way that speaks and is going to be received well by the culture.
Yeah, we're going to hear from students from America here in just a little bit. But Tammy, how are you getting the message out in this culture, specifically, media that doesn't want us to get the message out?
Well, it is difficult, as John said, and the media has gotten more biased, and they feel less of a duty to have balanced reporting. So they're more likely to go out and write a story and interview someone from the ACLU or Planned Parenthood or wherever and just ignore you because they don't really care about balancing the story. So one of the things that we have found that will work sometimes, not all the time, is just to put out a lot of press releases. Reporters are lazy these days, and if you tell them what to say and you put it in 2 sentences where they can't rip it apart, a lot of times they will print that because it's easy. And they don't have to do any research, they don't have to call you, they don't even have to go interview you. And so I think the press release is still working. And then we're sort of aggressive sometimes on getting the media to interview us. And so we will call, and we try to develop relationships with media so that that when they have an issue where they need a voice on our side, they will come to us. But we still use social media. I mean, what is it? 70 million people a day still use Facebook. And so even though there are algorithms and things that are intended to silence conservative groups like ours, I think you can get around those. I think we've done that, and we use a lot of social media advertising. I mean, we use paid advertising on Facebook because then you can target the right audience. And so I think those things are still working, but it's getting harder, yes.
So thank you very much. We are out of time. If you haven't visited the tables in the back, there's opportunities for you to connect with each of these groups. And if you want to be an influencer in your community and you feel passionate about it, you can come and talk to me, North Carolina Faith and Freedom. We'll be distributing voter guides and working out across the state, and we'll have volunteer and paid opportunities for you to do that as we get later into the summer and fall. So thank you very much, and we're going to turn it back to Paul.